My name is Rachel Martinez, and I'm 32 years old. 3 weeks ago, I held a piece of paper that would destroy my marriage, shatter my in-laws, perfect family image, and prove that sometimes being called too emotional is actually being too perceptive. The DNA test results showed 99.7% probability that my husband Marcus was not the biological father of our 3-year-old daughter Sophia. But this story isn't just about infidelity. It's about a woman who trusted her instincts when everyone around her gasped her for being paranoid, suspicious, and yes, too emotional. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Let me take you back to where this all began, because understanding my story requires understanding the life I thought I had built. Marcus and I met during our final year at Arizona State University. I was studying communications while working 2 part-time jobs to pay for school, and he was completing his business degree with the confident ease of someone whose parents had already secured him a position at their successful construction company, Martinez & Sons. Our first encounter happened in the most ordinary way possible. I was rushing between my morning shift at the campus bookstore and my afternoon classes, when I literally ran into him outside the student union. My coffee went flying, my books scattered across the sidewalk, and there was Marcus, tall and apologetic, helping me gather everything while insisting on buying me a replacement drink. He had this warm smile and an immediate way of making me feel like I was the only person who mattered in that moment. What drew me to Marcus initially was his genuine interest in my life. Unlike other guys I had dated who seemed intimidated by my work ethic or my ambitions, Marcus asked thoughtful questions about my goals and actually listened to the answers. When I told him I wanted to work in public relations for nonprofit organizations, he didn't dismiss it as impractical or suggest I aim for something more lucrative. Instead, he spent hours helping me research graduate programs and internship opportunities. We spent the remainder of that school year becoming inseparable. Marcus would pick me up after my closing shifts at the bookstore, bringing me dinner from whatever restaurant he had discovered that week. We studied together in the library, took weekend road trips to explore Arizona's desert landscapes, and talked for hours about our dreams for the future. He painted a picture of a partnership where we would support each other's ambitions while building something beautiful together. After graduation, I was accepted into a master's program in nonprofit management at the University of Denver, while Marcus began working for his family's business in Phoenix. We maintained a long-distance relationship for 2 years, visiting each other monthly and planning for the day we could be in the same city again. Marcus was patient, supportive, and unwavering in his commitment. When I finished my degree, he proposed during a surprise visit to Denver, presenting me with his grandmother's ring and a job offer he had helped arrange with a children's advocacy nonprofit in Phoenix. Our wedding was everything I had dreamed of: intimate, meaningful, and surrounded by people who genuinely celebrated our love. Marcus's family, the Martinez clan, welcomed me with open arms. His mother, Carmen, treated me like the daughter she had never had. His father, Roberto, included me in family business discussions and asked for my opinion on marketing strategies. His younger sister, Isabella, became my closest friend and confidant. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged to something larger than myself. My own family was smaller and more complicated. My parents had divorced when I was 15, and my relationship with them remained cordial but distant. My mother had remarried and moved to Oregon, while my father had thrown himself into his work as an accountant and rarely made time for personal relationships. Having the Martinez family embrace me so completely felt like a gift I had never expected to receive. Marcus and I settled into married life with ease. We bought a charming 1940s bungalow in a historic Phoenix neighborhood, spending weekends renovating the kitchen and planting citrus trees in the backyard. I thrived in my work with the nonprofit, developing fundraising campaigns and organizing community outreach programs. Marcus excelled in the family business, bringing fresh ideas and modern technology to a company that had been operating the same way for decades. 3 years into our marriage, we decided we were ready to start a family. I had always imagined myself as a mother, and Marcus spoke often about wanting to pass on the family traditions and values that had shaped him. We began trying to conceive with the same methodical approach we brought to everything else in our lives: tracking cycles, maintaining healthy lifestyles, and visualizing our future as parents. When I became pregnant 6 months later, our joy felt boundless. Marcus attended every doctor's appointment, assembled the crib before I was even showing, and spent evenings talking to my growing belly about all the adventures they would have together. His family was equally thrilled, with Carmen immediately beginning to knit blankets and Roberto starting a college fund for his future grandchild. Sophia entered the world on a crisp February morning after 12 hours of labor that Marcus weathered beside me, holding my hand and whispering encouragement. The moment the doctor placed her in my arms, I understood why people describe the love for a child as unlike anything else. She was perfect. Tiny fingers that gripped mine with surprising strength, dark hair that stuck up in impossible directions, and eyes that seemed to take in everything around her with curious intensity. Marcus cried when he first held her, telling me through his tears that she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. His family crowded into the hospital room within hours, each of them taking turns, marveling at this newest addition to their lineage. Carmen declared that Sophia had inherited the Martinez eyes, while Roberto insisted she had gotten his stubborn chin. Isabella appointed herself the fun aunt and immediately began planning all the ways she would spoil her niece. The first 2 years of Sophia's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights, first smiles, tentative steps, and countless moments of wonder. Marcus proved to be an attentive and devoted father, changing diapers without complaint, reading bedtime stories with dramatic voices, and documenting every milestone with the enthusiasm of a professional photographer. We fell into routines that felt natural and sustainable: weekend family breakfasts, evening walks around the neighborhood, bedtime rituals that involved all three of us. But somewhere around Sophia's second birthday, I began noticing things that didn't quite align with the harmony I thought we had achieved. Marcus started working longer hours, often claiming that new projects required his attention well into the evening. When I would call his office, his assistant would tell me he was in meetings or had stepped out, though he wouldn't return my calls for hours. He became protective of his phone in a way he had never been before, taking it with him to the bathroom and sleeping with it face down on his nightstand. When I mentioned these observations to Marcus, he dismissed them with explanations that seemed reasonable on the surface. The construction business was competitive, he reminded me, and his father was gradually transferring more responsibilities to him. The phone behavior was just a new habit he had developed to avoid work interruptions during family time. His increased fatigue was simply the result of taking on more challenging projects and learning new aspects of the business. I wanted to believe these explanations because the alternative was too unsettling to consider. Marcus had never given me reason to doubt his faithfulness or his commitment to.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Our family. He still told me he loved me every morning before leaving for work and every night before we went to sleep. He still played with Sophia with genuine delight, still participated in family gatherings with apparent enthusiasm, still made plans for our future that included all three of us. But my instincts kept nagging at me with increasing persistence. There were small inconsistencies in his stories about work events, unexplained charges on our credit card statements, and a general sense that he was present in body but absent in spirit during our family time. When I tried to discuss these concerns with him, Marcus would listen patiently before reassuring me that I was overthinking things, that new parenthood and work stress were making me see problems where none existed. The phrase, "you're being too emotional," became his standard response to any concern I raised. If I questioned why he had missed Sophia's doctor appointment after confirming he would attend, he would stroke my hair and tell me I was letting hormones cloud my judgment. If I asked about the woman's voice I heard laughing in the background when he called from supposedly empty work sites, he would sigh and explain that I was reading too much into innocent interactions with female subcontractors or architects. Gradually, I began to doubt my own perceptions. Maybe I was being overly sensitive. Maybe the transition from being a couple to being parents had affected my emotional equilibrium more than I realized. Maybe the hypervigilance that served me well in my professional life was creating phantom problems in my personal relationships. Marcus seemed so genuinely puzzled by my concerns, so patient with what he characterized as my irrational worries, that I started to believe the problem was with me rather than with his behavior. His family reinforced this interpretation whenever I tentatively shared my concerns. Carmen would remind me that the construction business required long and unpredictable hours, just as it had when Roberto was building the company. Isabella would laugh off my worries about Marcus's phone habits, pointing out that her generation was simply more attached to their devices than mine was. Roberto would assure me that Marcus was just experiencing the growing pains of increased responsibility, and that his dedication to work reflected his commitment to providing for his family. Their responses were always loving and well-intentioned, but they also made me feel foolish for having concerns in the first place. Here was a family that had known Marcus his entire life, who understood the pressures he was facing and the character he had always displayed. If they weren't worried about his behavior, why should I be? Clearly, my postpartum emotions and new mother anxieties were distorting my perspective. So I tried to quiet the voice in my head that insisted something was wrong. I focused on the positive aspects of our life together. Sophia's rapid development and delightful personality, my own growing success at work, the beautiful home we had created, and the family traditions we were establishing. I threw myself into organizing playdates and developmental activities for Sophia, expanding my professional responsibilities, and maintaining the household routines that kept our life running smoothly. But suppressing my instincts required constant mental energy. I found myself analyzing every interaction with Marcus, searching for evidence either that my concerns were justified or that they were unfounded. I became hyper-aware of his facial expressions, his tone of voice, his body language, looking for clues about his true state of mind. This level of scrutiny was exhausting and made spontaneous intimacy nearly impossible. Marcus seemed to interpret my increased attention as neediness, and he responded by creating even more distance. He began volunteering for business trips that would take him out of town for several days at a time. He started going to the gym early in the morning before work, claiming he needed the exercise to manage his stress levels. He accepted invitations to networking events and client dinners that required him to be away from home multiple evenings per week. Each of these activities had logical explanations, but their cumulative effect was that Marcus was spending less and less time with Sophia and me. When he was home, he seemed distracted and impatient, quick to suggest that I was being demanding when I asked for his help with bedtime routines or household tasks. He would remind me that he was working harder than ever to secure our family's financial future, and that my role was to manage the domestic responsibilities that would allow him to focus on his career. This division of labor might have worked if I hadn't been working full-time myself, but trying to excel in my professional role while managing the majority of childcare and household duties was becoming overwhelming. When I tried to discuss a more equitable distribution of responsibilities, Marcus would acknowledge my hard work while pointing out that his job was ultimately more financially crucial to our stability. He would promise to help more once his current project was completed or his latest deadline was met, but those moments of relief never seemed to arrive. The stress of managing everything alone while pretending that our marriage was as strong as ever began affecting my physical and emotional health. I was tired constantly, struggling to concentrate at work, and finding myself snapping at colleagues and friends over minor irritations. My doctor suggested that I was experiencing delayed postpartum depression and recommended therapy along with possible medication. I started seeing a counselor named Dr. Patricia Wells, hoping she could help me understand why I was feeling so disconnected from the life I had worked so hard to build. During our sessions, she encouraged me to trust my instincts, while also examining whether my expectations for marriage and parenthood might be unrealistic. She helped me recognize patterns in my relationship with Marcus that I had been too close to see clearly. Dr. Wells pointed out that Marcus's responses to my concerns followed a consistent pattern of minimizing, redirecting, and ultimately dismissing my feelings without addressing the underlying issues. She noted that healthy relationships required both partners to take each other's concerns seriously, even when those concerns seemed unfounded to the other person. She suggested that my increasing isolation and self-doubt were symptoms not of postpartum depression, but of a relationship dynamic that was undermining my confidence in my own perceptions. These insights were both validating and terrifying. If Dr. Wells was right, then my instincts about Marcus had been accurate all along, and I had been gaslit into questioning my own sanity. But if my instincts were correct, then the life I thought I was living was built on deception, and the man I had trusted completely was capable of betraying that trust while making me feel crazy for suspecting it. The turning point came on a Thursday evening in late October, when Marcus announced that he would be traveling to Tucson the following week for a 3-day conference on sustainable construction practices. This was the type of professional development opportunity that would benefit both his career and the family business, so I didn't question the trip itself. However, something about the way he delivered this information felt different from his usual approach to work travel. Marcus seemed nervous as he explained the conference details, avoiding direct eye contact and providing more information than I had requested. He showed me the conference website on his laptop, pointing out specific sessions he planned to attend and speakers he was excited to hear. He mentioned that several other construction company owners would be attending, people he was looking forward to networking with. The level of detail felt rehearsed rather than spontaneous. After Marcus went to bed that night, I found myself unable to sleep. Something about his conference story bothered me, though I couldn't identify exactly what seemed wrong. Finally, I got up and went to the living room where his laptop was, still open on the coffee table. I told myself I was just going to look at the conference website again to understand why his announcement had felt so strange. What I discovered sent a chill through my entire body. The conference Marcus had described so enthusiastically had actually taken place the previous month. The website clearly showed that the annual Sustainable Construction Conference had been held in September, not November. The speakers he had mentioned, the sessions he planned to attend, the networking opportunities he was excited about, all of it had already happened weeks earlier. I sat in our dark living room, staring at the laptop screen and trying to process what this meant. Marcus had lied to me about a work conference, creating an elaborate fiction complete with specific details and visual evidence. This wasn't a simple miscommunication or a mistake about dates. This was a deliberate deception that he had planned and executed with careful attention to detail. My hands were shaking as I began to consider the implications. If Marcus was lying about this conference, what else had he been lying about? How many of his late nights at work, his business trips, his networking events, and his client dinners had been fabrications designed to conceal his real activities? How long had I been living with someone who was capable of looking me in the eye and lying with such conviction that I never suspected the truth? I closed the laptop and sat in the darkness for hours, my mind racing through months of interactions and looking for other signs I might have missed. Suddenly, his protective behavior around his phone made perfect sense, as did his increased absences and his dismissive responses to my concerns. He hadn't been working longer hours to advance his career and provide for our family. He had been maintaining a secret life that required him to spend time away from home while creating believable explanations for his absence. The knowledge that Marcus was lying to me was devastating, but it was also strangely liberating. For months I had been questioning my own judgment, wondering if my concerns were the product of an overactive imagination or emotional instability. Now I had concrete proof that my instincts had been accurate all along. I wasn't crazy, overly emotional, or paranoid. I was perceptive enough to recognize when something was wrong, even when the person I trusted most was working to convince me otherwise. As dawn broke through our bedroom windows, I watched Marcus sleep peacefully beside me and wondered how many other secrets he was keeping. I thought about Sophia, sleeping innocently in her crib down the hall, unaware that her parents' marriage was built on deception. I thought about his family, who had embraced me so completely, and who would be devastated to learn that their golden son was capable of such betrayal. Most of all, I thought about what I was going to do with this knowledge. Confronting Marcus about the conference lie would reveal that I had been checking up on him, which would likely lead to accusations that I was invading his privacy and being suspicious without cause. But staying silent would mean continuing to live with someone I could no longer trust, pretending that our marriage was solid while knowing that he was actively deceiving me. The internal conflict was excruciating. Part of me wanted to confront Marcus immediately, to demand an explanation and insist on complete honesty about everything he had been hiding. Part of me wanted to hire a private investigator to gather more evidence before taking any action. Part of me wanted to confide in someone. Drive. Wells, my few close friends, or even Marcus's sister Isabella, but I knew that sharing my suspicions would make the situation irreversibly real. Instead, I decided to begin paying closer attention to Marcus's behavior and looking for additional evidence of deception. If he was lying about work conferences, there were probably other lies I could uncover with careful observation. I needed to know the full scope of his dishonesty before deciding how to respond. This decision felt both empowering and horrible. Empowering because I was taking control of the situation rather than passively accepting his explanations. Horrible because it meant acknowledging that my marriage had become an investigation rather than a partnership. Over the following weeks, I became a detective in my own home. I started noting the times Marcus left for work and returned home, comparing his stated schedule with his actual whereabouts. I began paying attention to background noises during his phone calls, looking for inconsistencies between what he claimed to be doing and what I could hear. I discreetly checked his pockets when he showered, looking for receipts or other evidence of his activities. This surveillance felt like a betrayal of everything our marriage was supposed to represent, but it also revealed a pattern of deception that was far more extensive than I had imagined. Marcus was regularly lying about his whereabouts, his work responsibilities, and his social activities. He was creating elaborate fictions to account for his time while showing no apparent guilt or remorse about his dishonesty. The emotional toll of living with this knowledge while maintaining a facade of normalcy was enormous. I had to pretend to believe his lies while gathering evidence of his deception. I had to act like a loving wife while feeling increasingly like a stranger in my own home. I had to maintain friendly relationships with his family while knowing that their beloved son and brother was not the person they thought he was. But perhaps the most difficult aspect was continuing to co-parent Sophia while questioning everything about our family dynamic. Every time Marcus played with her, read her stories, or tucked her into bed, I wondered how he could be so loving and attentive with our daughter while being so dishonest with me. Every time Sophia smiled at him with pure adoration, I worried about what his deception would mean for her sense of security and trust. The constant mental strain began affecting every aspect of my life. I was making mistakes at work, forgetting important deadlines, and struggling to maintain my usual level of professional competence. My friends started commenting that I seemed distracted and stressed, asking if everything was okay at home. I deflected their concerns with vague references to the challenges of balancing work and motherhood, unable to admit that my marriage was falling apart. Dr. Wells noticed the change in my demeanor immediately. During our sessions, she observed that I seemed more anxious and hypervigilant than before, but also more grounded in reality. When I finally told her about discovering Marcus's lie about the conference, she validated my decision to gather more information while cautioning me about the psychological cost of living in a state of constant suspicion. She helped me understand that my investigative behavior was a normal response to discovering betrayal, but that it couldn't continue indefinitely without destroying my mental health. She encouraged me to set a timeline for gathering information and making decisions about my marriage, rather than allowing the uncertainty to drag on indefinitely. She also reminded me that I deserved to be in a relationship built on honesty and mutual respect, regardless of what I discovered about Marcus's behavior. As November progressed into December, the evidence of Marcus's deception continued to accumulate. I found receipts for restaurants he had never mentioned visiting, discovered charges for hotels in Phoenix when he claimed to be working late at local job sites, and noticed that his explanations for his whereabouts often didn't align with the information I could verify independently. The most devastating discovery came in early December when I found a parking receipt in his jacket pocket from a shopping center across town, dated and timed during a period when he had claimed to be in meetings at the office. The receipt was from the same day he had missed Sophia's parent-teacher conference at daycare, apologizing profusely and explaining that an important client meeting had run late. That night, as Marcus slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling and faced the truth I had been avoiding. My husband was having an affair. All of his lies, his absences, his defensive responses to my concerns, and his attempts to make me question my own perceptions were designed to conceal his relationship with another woman. The man I had trusted completely, the father of my child, the person I had planned to spend my life with, was living a double life. The knowledge felt like a physical blow that left me gasping for air. Everything I thought I knew about our marriage, our family, and our future had been an illusion carefully maintained by someone who claimed to love me. The life I had been working so hard to preserve and protect had never actually existed in the way I believed it did. But along with the devastation came a strange sense of relief. Finally, I had an explanation for the disconnection I had been feeling, the inconsistencies I had been noticing, and the emotional distance that had been growing between us. I wasn't crazy, overly emotional, or paranoid. I was a woman whose instincts had been trying to protect her from a painful truth that everyone around her was encouraging her to ignore. The question now was what I was going to do with this knowledge. The evidence I had gathered proved that Marcus was being dishonest, but it didn't provide details about the nature or extent of his affair. I didn't know who the other woman was, how long the relationship had been going on, or what his intentions were regarding our marriage. Part of me wanted to confront him with what I had discovered and demand complete honesty about everything. Part of me wanted to continue gathering information until I had a complete picture of his betrayal. But there was another consideration that was becoming increasingly important to me. If Marcus was having an affair, there was a possibility that Sophia was not his biological daughter. The timing of his changed behavior seemed to coincide with her birth, which could mean that he had been unfaithful during my pregnancy or even earlier. If that was the case, then everything about our family structure was built on an even more fundamental deception than I had imagined. The thought of questioning Sophia's paternity felt like crossing a line that I could never uncross. Once I opened that door, there would be no going back to the life I had known, regardless of what the truth turned out to be. But the possibility gnawed at me with increasing intensity. If Marcus had been unfaithful, and if there was any chance that Sophia was not his biological daughter, then I needed to know for her sake as well as my own. After several sleepless nights, I made the decision that would change everything. I was going to order a DNA test. Not because I wanted to destroy our family or because I was looking for a reason to leave Marcus, but because I needed to know the truth about everything. If Sophia was Marcus's daughter, then at least one aspect of our life together was genuine. If she wasn't, then I needed to understand the full scope of the deception I was dealing with. The decision felt both terrifying and empowering. For months, I had been living in uncertainty, questioning my own perceptions while being told I was too emotional to think clearly. Now I was going to get concrete scientific answers to at least some of my questions. The DNA test would provide objective truth that couldn't be dismissed, minimized, or explained away. I ordered the test online, choosing a reputable company that promised accurate results and complete confidentiality. The kit arrived 3 days later in discreet packaging that revealed nothing about its contents. I collected the samples during Marcus's next business trip, when I could be certain he wouldn't interrupt the process or ask uncomfortable questions about what I was doing. Taking Sophia's sample was heartbreaking. As I gently swabbed the inside of her cheek while she slept, I was overwhelmed by love for this innocent child who had no role in the adult complications surrounding her existence. Regardless of what the test revealed about her biological paternity, she would always be my daughter in every way that mattered. But I needed to know the truth about her genetic heritage for medical reasons, if nothing else. Collecting Marcus's sample required more creativity. I waited until he left for work one morning, then retrieved his toothbrush from our bathroom and carefully extracted the genetic material according to the kit's instructions. The process felt like a violation of his privacy, but his deception had already violated the trust that made such privacy possible in the first place. I shipped the samples on a Friday afternoon and was told that results would be available within 7 to 10 business days. The waiting period felt interminable. Every interaction with Marcus took on new significance, as I wondered whether I was looking at Sophia's biological father or at a man who had been pretending to be her father, while knowing the truth was different. During this waiting period, Marcus's behavior became even more suspicious. He started receiving phone calls that he would answer in another room, speaking in hushed tones that made it impossible for me to hear the content of his conversations. He began making excuses to leave the house for short errands that seemed unnecessary and took longer than they should have. His phone was constantly buzzing with text messages that he would read quickly before deleting immediately. When I tried to ask about these changes in his routine, Marcus responded with increasing irritation. He accused me of being controlling and invasive, suggesting that my questions reflected my own insecurities rather than any actual problems with his behavior. He reminded me that he was working harder than ever to provide for our family, and that my lack of trust was making it difficult for him to focus on his responsibilities. The gaslighting that had been subtle before became more overt and aggressive. Marcus began questioning my memory of conversations we had had, insisting that I was misremembering his words or taking them out of context. He suggested that my postpartum hormones were still affecting my emotional stability, and that I should consider medication to help me think more clearly. He recommended that I spend more time with friends or take up a hobby that would give me something to focus on besides our relationship. But instead of making me doubt myself as they had before, these responses now felt like confirmation that my suspicions were justified. A husband who was being honest about his activities wouldn't need to deflect questions with personal attacks on his wife's mental state. A man who is committed to his marriage wouldn't respond to his wife's concerns by suggesting that she was fundamentally flawed. The DNA test results became available on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after I had submitted the samples. I received an email notification while I was at work, sitting in my office and trying to concentrate on a grant proposal that was due by the end of the week. My hands were shaking as I clicked on the link that would take me to the secure portal where the results were waiting. The screen seemed to take forever to load, and I found myself holding my breath as the page finally appeared. The results were presented in clinical, objective language that somehow made their devastating implications even more shocking. Marcus was not Sophia's biological father. The test showed a 99.7% probability that he was not related to the child I had believed was his daughter. I stared at the screen for several minutes, reading and rereading the results, as if the words might change if I looked at them long enough. But the science was unambiguous. The man who had been present for Sophia's birth, who had changed her diapers and taught her to walk, who had read her bedtime stories and planned for her future, was not her biological father. The implications hit me in waves. First came the confirmation that my instincts about Marcus's faithfulness had been correct all along. If he wasn't Sophia's father, then I had been unfaithful during the time she was conceived. But I knew with absolute certainty that I had never been with anyone else during my marriage. Which meant that Marcus knew Sophia wasn't his biological daughter and had been pretending otherwise for more than 3 years. The level of deception was staggering. Not only had Marcus been having an affair, but he had allowed me to believe that he was Sophia's father, while knowing the truth was different. He had accepted congratulations on her birth, posed for family photos, and planned for her future, all while knowing that she wasn't genetically his child. The cruelty of this deception was almost incomprehensible. But then came an even more disturbing realization. If Marcus wasn't Sophia's father, and I had been faithful throughout our marriage, then I must have been unfaithful at some point without remembering it. The only explanation that made sense was that I had been assaulted or drugged at some point during the period when Sophia was conceived, and that Marcus had discovered this truth after her birth. The possibility that I had been violated without my knowledge or memory was terrifying and nauseating. But it would explain Marcus's changed behavior around the time of Sophia's birth, his increasing emotional distance, and his reluctance to discuss having more children. It would also explain why he had never confronted me directly about infidelity, because he knew that I wasn't responsible for what had happened. I sat in my office chair, overwhelmed by the implications of what I had discovered. The DNA test had answered one question definitively, but it had raised dozens of others that were equally important and far more complex. I needed to understand not just who Sophia's biological father was, but how and when I had been exposed to him without my knowledge or consent. The rest of that workday passed in a blur of automatic responses and mechanical tasks. I managed to complete the grant proposal and attend the meetings on my calendar, but my mind was entirely focused on processing the DNA results and planning my next steps. I knew that I needed to confront Marcus with what I had discovered, but I also knew that this conversation would irrevocably change our lives and our family dynamics. When I arrived home that evening, Marcus was already there, playing with Sophia in the living room while dinner cooked on the stove. The scene looked so normal, so loving, that it was almost impossible to believe that everything about it was built on deception. Marcus looked up when I walked in, smiling and asking about my day as if nothing had changed. Sophia ran to greet me with the enthusiasm she showed every evening, wrapping her small arms around my legs and chattering about her adventures at daycare. I went through the motions of our evening routine, eating dinner, giving Sophia her bath, reading her bedtime stories, and tucking her into bed. Marcus participated as he always did, seemingly unaware that I had spent the day processing the knowledge that our entire family dynamic was based on lies he had been maintaining for years. After Sophia was asleep, I found Marcus in the kitchen, loading the dishwasher and humming quietly to himself. The domesticity of the moment felt surreal given what I now knew about our situation. This was the man who had gaslit me for months, making me believe that my concerns were symptoms of emotional instability rather than accurate perceptions of reality. This was the man who had allowed me to believe he was Sophia's father, while knowing that the truth was completely different. I sat down at our kitchen table and took a deep breath, knowing that the words I was about to speak would change everything. "Marcus," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos in my mind, "we need to talk. There's something I've discovered that affects our entire family, and I need you to be completely honest with me for the first time in months." He turned from the dishwasher with a puzzled expression, as if he couldn't imagine what I might want to discuss. The innocent confusion in his eyes felt like another manipulation, another attempt to make me doubt what I knew to be true. But this time I had scientific evidence that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. This time I was holding all the cards. Marcus dried his hands on the kitchen towel, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The casual way he approached our conversation table told me he had no idea what was coming. He settled into the chair across from me with the same relaxed posture he always adopted during our evening talks, ready to discuss weekend plans or Sophia's developmental milestones. I reached into my purse and withdrew the printed DNA test results, placing them on the table between us without a word. The clinical letterhead was clearly visible, along with the bold text that summarized the findings. Marcus glanced down at the papers, and I watched his face transform as he processed what he was seeing. The color drained from his cheeks so quickly that I thought he might faint. His eyes widened as they moved across the page, taking in the technical details and the unmistakable conclusion. His hands, which had been resting casually on the table, began to tremble slightly. The confident, dismissive demeanor he had maintained for months crumbled in an instant. "Rachel?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Where did you get this?" "I think the more important question is why you never told me," I replied, keeping my tone as calm and measured as possible. "How long have you known that Sophia isn't your biological daughter?" Marcus stared at the papers for several more seconds before looking up at me with an expression I had never seen before. Gone was the patient condescension he had shown whenever I raised concerns about our relationship. Gone was the confident dismissal of my emotional reactions to his behavior. Instead, I saw something that looked like fear mixed with resignation. "I've known since she was about 6 months old," he admitted quietly. "I had the test done when she got sick with that ear infection and needed antibiotics. The doctor asked about family medical history, and I realized I didn't know anything about genetic predispositions from my side. So I ordered a paternity test, just to have complete information for her medical records." The matter-of-fact way he delivered this explanation was almost as shocking as the admission itself. He spoke as if genetic testing was a routine part of pediatric care, rather than an investigation into his wife's fidelity. The casual tone suggested he had been rehearsing this conversation in his mind for years, preparing for the day when the truth would inevitably surface. "And you never thought to discuss this with me?" I asked, my voice rising slightly despite my efforts to remain composed. "You've known for more than 2 years that the child I believed was ours together isn't biologically yours, and you said nothing?" Marcus ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I recognized as his response to stress, but instead of the defensive anger I expected, he seemed to deflate further. "What was I supposed to say, Rachel? That my wife had been unfaithful and that our daughter wasn't mine? That everything about our family was built on a lie?" The accusation hit me like a physical blow. After months of questioning my own sanity and being told I was too emotional to think clearly, Marcus was now suggesting that I had been the one deceiving him. The implication that I had been unfaithful during our marriage was so far from reality that I almost laughed. "Unfaithful?" I repeated, my voice sharp with disbelief. "Marcus, I have never been with anyone else during our entire relationship. Not once, not ever. If Sophia isn't your biological daughter, then someone else is responsible, and it wasn't a consensual encounter." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with implications that neither of us wanted to fully explore. Marcus's expression shifted from resignation to confusion, as if he was processing possibilities he had never considered before. "What are you saying?" he asked slowly. "I'm saying that if I conceived a child who isn't genetically yours, and I was never willingly intimate with anyone else, then something happened to me without my knowledge or consent," I explained, surprised by how steady my voice remained despite the horror of what I was suggesting. "And instead of supporting me through that realization, you've spent 2 years making me feel crazy for noticing that something was wrong." Marcus stared at me for a long moment, his face cycling through emotions I couldn't identify. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I never thought about that possibility. When I got the test results, I just assumed you had been with someone else. I was so angry and hurt that I couldn't think about alternative explanations. So instead of talking to me about it, you decided to punish me by withdrawing emotionally and making me question my own perceptions," I said, the pieces of his behavior finally falling into place. "Every time I noticed that you were distant or secretive, you told me I was being too emotional. Every time I asked about inconsistencies in your stories, you made me feel like I was paranoid or unstable." The pattern was clear now. Marcus had discovered that Sophia wasn't his biological daughter, and had concluded that I had been unfaithful. Instead of confronting me directly, he had chosen to express his anger through passive-aggressive punishment, designed to make me suffer without understanding why. He had systematically undermined my confidence in my own judgment, while maintaining the facade of a loving husband and father. "I didn't know how to handle it," Marcus said weakly. "I kept thinking I should leave, but then I would look at Sophia and couldn't imagine abandoning her. She's innocent in all of this, and I do love her, even if she's not biologically mine." "But you couldn't love me anymore," I observed. "Because you believed I had betrayed you." Marcus nodded miserably. "I tried to get past it, but every time I looked at you, I wondered who you had been with and why you had lied to me about it. I started questioning everything about our relationship, wondering what else you might be hiding." The irony was devastating. While Marcus had been questioning my honesty and fidelity, he had been the one lying and hiding things. His suspicious behavior, his secretive phone calls, his unexplained absences, all of it had been real, but not for the reasons I had imagined. He hadn't been having an affair with another woman. He had been emotionally withdrawing from our marriage, while struggling with his assumptions about my supposed infidelity. "The conference that never happened," I said suddenly, remembering the discovery that had started my investigation. "The sustainable construction event that you claimed to be attending in Tucson, why did you lie about that?" Marcus looked genuinely confused for a moment before understanding dawned in his eyes. "I wasn't lying about a conference. I was going to see a lawyer. I wanted to understand my options for divorce and custody, given that Sophia isn't my biological daughter. I couldn't tell you I was consulting an attorney, so I made up the conference story." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Marcus hadn't been having an affair at all. He had been planning to leave our marriage while trying to figure out how to maintain a relationship with the daughter he believed wasn't his. His secretive behavior, his protective attitude toward his phone, his emotional distance, all of it had been related to his preparations for ending our marriage, not to another romantic relationship. "So all this time, when I was worried that you were having an affair, you were actually planning to divorce me," I said, trying to process this new information. "And you never once considered that there might be another explanation for the DNA results." "I should have," Marcus admitted, "but I was so hurt and angry that I couldn't think rationally. The test results seemed to confirm my worst fears about our marriage, and I just accepted them without questioning what they really meant." We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us grappling with the implications of what had been revealed. The foundation of our conflict had been built on Marcus's incorrect assumptions about my character and behavior. He had believed I was capable of infidelity and deception, and that belief had poisoned every interaction between us for more than 2 years. "We need to figure out what really happened," I said finally. "If Sophia isn't your biological daughter, and I was never willingly intimate with anyone else, then we need to understand how this is possible." Marcus nodded slowly. "Where do we start?" I had been thinking about this question since receiving the DNA results, trying to identify any period during our relationship when I might have been vulnerable to assault without remembering it. The most likely scenario involved alcohol or drugs that could have impaired my memory, but I rarely drank to excess and had never used recreational drugs. We need to think about any time when I might have been incapacitated or unconscious, I said, hating even to voice the possibility. Times when I was drinking, or taking medication, or otherwise not fully aware of my surroundings. Marcus's face went pale as he began to understand what I was suggesting. You think someone drugged you? I think it's the only explanation that makes sense, I replied. And if that's what happened, then we need to figure out when and where it occurred, so we can identify who might be Sophia's biological father. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of my life. Marcus and I went through my calendar from the months before Sophia's conception, trying to identify any events where I might have been vulnerable. We discussed parties we had attended, work functions I had gone to, evenings out with friends, and any other social situations where someone could have slipped something into my drink. The process was emotionally exhausting and deeply disturbing. Every social interaction from that period now seemed potentially sinister. Every moment when I had felt unusually tired or confused after drinking became suspect. Every gap in my memory, no matter how minor, took on new and frightening significance. As we worked through the timeline, one event stood out as particularly suspicious. In early June, about 9 months before Sophia's birth, I had attended the annual fundraising gala for my nonprofit organization. It was a large event with several hundred attendees, including major donors, community leaders, and representatives from other charitable organizations. I remembered feeling unusually unwell that evening, despite having consumed only 1 glass of wine with dinner. I had attributed my discomfort to stress about the event and the long hours I had been working to prepare for it. But looking back with new perspective, my symptoms seemed consistent with having been drugged. I felt dizzy and nauseous around 9 o'clock, I recalled, trying to piece together the details of that evening. I thought I was coming down with something, so I asked you to take me home early. But the drive home is completely blank in my memory. I don't remember leaving the venue, getting in the car, or arriving at our house. Marcus was listening intently, his expression growing more troubled as I described my experience. I remember that night, he said slowly. You were acting really strange in the car. You kept saying you felt confused and asking where we were going, even though we were driving to our own house. When we got home, you went straight to bed and slept for almost 12 hours. The memory gap was significant and alarming. I had attended similar events many times before and after that night, often staying much later and drinking more, without experiencing anything like those symptoms. The timing also aligned perfectly with Sophia's conception, making it highly likely that this was when the assault had occurred. Do you remember who I was talking to at the gala? I asked, hoping Marcus might have noticed something I had missed. Anyone who paid unusual attention to me or seemed particularly interested in my activities? Marcus frowned, trying to recall details from an evening that had occurred nearly 4 years earlier. There were so many people there, and I spent most of the night networking with potential business contacts. But I do remember that you were talking to several major donors throughout the evening, including some people I didn't recognize. This was frustrating but not surprising. The gala had been a large, crowded event, with multiple conversations happening simultaneously. Unless someone's behavior had been obviously inappropriate, it would have been easy for predatory actions to go unnoticed in the social chaos. We need a list of everyone who attended that event, I said, feeling sick as I contemplated the investigation we would need to undertake. If someone assaulted me there, they might be Sophia's biological father. The practical implications of this realization were staggering. We would need to contact my former colleagues at the nonprofit to obtain guest lists from the gala. We would need to research the backgrounds of potential suspects. We might need to conduct additional DNA tests to identify Sophia's biological father. The process would be invasive, time-consuming, and emotionally devastating for everyone involved. But there was another consideration that was even more important than our own discomfort. If someone had assaulted me at the gala, they might have done the same thing to other women. Our investigation might uncover a pattern of predatory behavior that could help protect future victims. We had a responsibility to pursue the truth, regardless of how painful it might be. I'll call Jennifer tomorrow, I said, referring to my former supervisor at the nonprofit. She'll have access to the guest lists and vendor information from that event. If we're lucky, she might even remember if there were any complaints or unusual incidents that night. Marcus nodded, but his expression remained troubled. Rachel, there's something else we need to consider. If we do identify Sophia's biological father through this investigation, what are we going to do with that information? The question highlighted the complexity of our situation. Sophia was an innocent child who had been raised by Marcus as his daughter for more than 3 years. Her biological father was potentially a criminal who had assaulted her mother. The truth about her conception could not change the love and care she had received, but it would inevitably affect her understanding of her identity and family history. I don't know, I admitted. But she deserves to know the truth about her medical history, even if we never tell her the full story about how she was conceived. And if her biological father is still out there potentially harming other women, we have an obligation to stop him. We talked until nearly midnight, trying to plan our next steps while processing the emotional weight of what we had discovered. Marcus apologized repeatedly for his assumptions about my fidelity and for the way he had treated me since learning about the DNA results. He acknowledged that his behavior had been cruel and manipulative, regardless of what he had believed about my actions. I should have talked to you as soon as I got the test results, he said as we finally prepared for bed. Even if I believed you had been unfaithful, you deserved the chance to explain what had happened. I was so focused on my own pain that I didn't consider what you might be going through. His apology was sincere, but it couldn't undo 2 years of emotional manipulation and gaslighting. The damage to our relationship ran deeper than misunderstandings about Sophia's paternity. Marcus had shown me that when faced with a crisis, his instinct was to withdraw and punish, rather than to communicate and seek understanding. That pattern of behavior would affect our marriage, regardless of what we discovered about the assault. The next morning, I called Jennifer before going to work, explaining that I needed information about the June gala for personal reasons I couldn't fully discuss. She was surprised by my request, but agreed to email me the guest list and vendor information from that event. She also promised to check her files for any incident reports or unusual complaints from that evening. When the information arrived later that day, I was overwhelmed by the scope of the task ahead of us. The guest list included more than 400 names, ranging from local business leaders to philanthropic foundations to individual donors. The vendor list was equally extensive, including catering staff, musicians, photographers, and numerous other service providers. Jennifer had also included a brief note explaining that there had been one unusual incident that night. A female attendee had reported feeling unwell and had asked venue security to help her find her husband. The woman had seemed disoriented and confused, according to the security report, but her husband had taken her home before any medical assistance could be provided. The incident had been documented but not investigated further, since the woman had left voluntarily with someone who identified himself as her spouse. Reading this report sent a chill through my entire body. The woman Jennifer described sounded exactly like me on the night of the gala. Marcus had indeed taken me home after I felt unwell, but the security guard's description of my condition was more alarming than I had remembered. If I had seemed disoriented enough to require assistance from venue security, my symptoms had been more severe than either Marcus or I had realized at the time. This information also suggested that my condition had been noticeable enough to attract attention from other people at the event. Someone had observed my distress and had been concerned enough to document it. This could be valuable evidence if we eventually needed to prove that I had been drugged, but it also meant that my vulnerability had been visible to everyone around me, including whoever had caused it. I shared this information with Marcus that evening, and we began the overwhelming process of researching the people who had attended the gala. We started with the individuals I remembered interacting with, looking for any red flags in their backgrounds or any patterns of concerning behavior. The research was tedious and often fruitless. Most of the attendees were respected community members with no obvious criminal history or history of misconduct. But we did identify several individuals who had faced allegations of sexual harassment or assault in professional or personal contexts. These men became our primary suspects, though we had no concrete evidence linking any of them to what had happened to me. After a week of investigation, we had narrowed our list to 6 potential suspects. All were men who had attended the gala, had previous allegations of sexual misconduct, and had been in positions where they could have had access to my drinks throughout the evening. The next step would be to obtain DNA samples from these individuals for comparison with Sophia's genetic profile. This is where our amateur investigation hit a wall. We couldn't simply approach these men and ask for DNA samples without revealing why we wanted them. We couldn't hire a private investigator to collect samples without potentially violating laws about consent and privacy. We needed professional help. But involving law enforcement would mean making formal accusations against specific individuals based on limited evidence. After consulting with a criminal attorney, we learned that our situation was legally complex. The assault had occurred nearly 4 years earlier, which was beyond the statute of limitations for prosecution in our state. Even if we could prove that one of our suspects was Sophia's biological father, we couldn't necessarily prove that the conception had occurred through assault rather than consensual contact. The attorney explained that our best option might be to work with law enforcement to investigate whether our suspects had committed similar crimes against other victims. If we could establish a pattern of behavior, it might be possible to build a case even without being able to prosecute the specific assault against me. This approach would require us to go public with our allegations, at least within law enforcement circles. Our private family crisis would become part of an official investigation that could attract media attention and public scrutiny. The impact on Sophia, who was still too young to understand the complexities of her situation, could be significant and lasting. Marcus and I spent hours discussing whether to move forward with involving law enforcement. The decision would affect not just our own lives, but Sophia's future and potentially the lives of other women who might be at risk from the same predator. The weight of that responsibility was enormous. In the end, it was thinking about Sophia that helped us make the decision. If someone had assaulted her mother and was potentially continuing to harm other women, she deserved to grow up in a world where that person was held accountable. We couldn't let our discomfort with publicity or legal complications prevent us from seeking justice. We contacted the Phoenix Police Department and requested a meeting with a detective who specialized in sexual assault cases. Detective Maria Santos was a 20-year veteran who had extensive experience with cases involving drugging and date rape. She listened to our story with professional compassion and helped us understand the investigative process that would follow. Detective Santos explained that our case would be challenging, but not impossible to pursue. The time that had elapsed since the assault made some types of evidence unavailable, but the DNA evidence was still valuable for identifying perpetrators and connecting cases. She agreed to begin an investigation into our suspect list and to look for similar cases that might involve the same individuals. The formal investigation moved slowly but thoroughly. Detective Santos interviewed other women who had attended the gala, looking for anyone else who had experienced unusual symptoms or memory gaps that evening. She researched the backgrounds of our suspects in much greater detail than we had been able to accomplish independently. She also checked databases of unsolved sexual assault cases to look for patterns that might connect to our situation. 3 weeks into the investigation, Detective Santos called with significant news. One of our suspects, a prominent real estate developer named David Kellerman, had been connected to 2 other cases involving women who had reported being drugged at social events. In both cases, the women had experienced symptoms similar to mine and had memory gaps during the periods when they were most vulnerable. More importantly, one of these women had reported her assault within 24 hours of the incident, which had allowed investigators to collect physical evidence that confirmed she had been drugged. Her case was still within the statute of limitations, which meant that charges could be filed if additional evidence connected Kellerman to the crime. Detective Santos requested permission to obtain a DNA sample from Kellerman for comparison with the evidence from the other cases and with Sophia's genetic profile. If the test confirmed that he was Sophia's biological father, it would provide strong circumstantial evidence that he had assaulted me at the gala. The DNA comparison took 2 weeks to complete. During that time, Marcus and I struggled with the emotional weight of potentially identifying the man who had assaulted me and fathered my daughter. The abstract horror of knowing that Sophia had been conceived through assault was difficult enough to process. The possibility of putting a name and face to her biological father made the trauma feel more immediate and personal. When Detective Santos called with the results, I was at work, sitting in my office and trying to focus on a presentation I was scheduled to give the following day. Her voice was professional but gentle as she delivered the news that would change everything. David Kellerman was Sophia's biological father. The DNA evidence was conclusive, showing a 99.8% probability that he was the man who had assaulted me at the gala nearly 4 years earlier. I hung up the phone and sat in my office chair, staring out the window at the Phoenix skyline while trying to process what this meant. Sophia's biological father was a successful businessman who had built his wealth by taking advantage of vulnerable women. He had a history of drugging women at social events and assaulting them when they were incapacitated. He was a predator who had never faced consequences for his actions. But now he would. Detective Santos explained that the evidence from our case, combined with the evidence from the other women he had assaulted, was sufficient to file charges. Kellerman would be arrested and prosecuted for multiple counts of sexual assault. His pattern of predatory behavior would finally be exposed and stopped. The vindication was sweet, but it was also complicated by the knowledge that Sophia would have to grow up knowing that her biological father was a criminal. She would need to understand, when she was old enough, that her conception was the result of violence rather than love. We would need to help her process this information in a way that didn't damage her sense of self-worth or security. Marcus took the news with a mixture of relief and renewed guilt. He was grateful that we had identified the perpetrator, and that other women would be protected from future assaults. But he was also devastated by the realization that he had spent 2 years punishing me for a crime that had been committed against me. "I'm so sorry," he said that evening as we sat together on our couch, both of us emotionally exhausted from the day's revelations. "I should have known that you would never be unfaithful. I should have looked for other explanations instead of assuming the worst about your character." His apology was heartfelt, but it couldn't undo the damage that had been done to our relationship. The months of gaslighting, emotional withdrawal, and manipulation had created wounds that would take time and effort to heal. We would need professional help to rebuild the trust and intimacy that had been lost. But for the first time in years, I felt like we were finally dealing with the truth about our situation. The secrets and lies that had poisoned our marriage were finally being exposed and addressed. We had a long road ahead of us, both in terms of the legal proceedings against Kellerman and the work required to repair our relationship, but at least we were moving forward with complete honesty about what had happened. The next morning brought new challenges. Detective Santos called to explain that Kellerman had been arrested at his office and charged with 3 counts of sexual assault. The local media had picked up the story, and our names were being mentioned in connection with the case. We would need to prepare for public attention and possibly intrusive questions about our family situation. This was the moment when our private trauma became a public matter. The phone began ringing early in the morning with calls from reporters who wanted to interview us about the case. Our neighbors started looking at us with curious expressions when we came and went from our house. Sophia's daycare director called to ask whether we needed any special support or security measures. The attention was overwhelming and uncomfortable, but it also felt like vindication for all the months when I had been told I was too emotional to trust my own perceptions. The same instincts that had led me to suspect Marcus was hiding something had ultimately led to the identification of a serial predator. My emotional responses hadn't been excessive or irrational. They had been appropriate reactions to real threats and deceptions. Over the following weeks, more women came forward with allegations against Kellerman. Detective Santos told us that our case had opened the floodgates for other victims who had been afraid to speak out against such a prominent community figure. The investigation expanded to include incidents spanning more than a decade, revealing a pattern of predatory behavior that was far more extensive than anyone had initially suspected. The legal proceedings would take months to complete, but the evidence against Kellerman was overwhelming. His attorneys eventually advised him to accept a plea agreement, rather than risk the sentences he would face if convicted at trial. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison and required to register as a sex offender upon his release. Justice had been served, but the emotional work of healing from this trauma was just beginning. Marcus and I started couples therapy to address the damage that had been done to our relationship during the years when we had been operating from false assumptions about each other. I also began individual therapy to process the assault and its aftermath. Sophia remained blissfully unaware of the complexities surrounding her conception and parentage. To her, Marcus was simply dad, and the legal proceedings were incomprehensible adult business that didn't affect her daily life of daycare, playdates, and bedtime stories. We decided to wait until she was much older before explaining the truth about her biological father, focusing instead on reinforcing her sense of security and belonging in our family. The therapy sessions were difficult but necessary. Marcus had to confront the ways that his assumptions about my character had led him to emotionally abuse me for months. I had to process not only the original assault, but also the secondary trauma of being gaslit and manipulated by the person I trusted most. We both had to learn new patterns of communication that prioritized honesty and vulnerability over self-protection. Slowly, carefully, we began to rebuild our relationship on a foundation of truth rather than assumptions. Marcus learned to trust my perceptions and emotional responses instead of dismissing them as excessive. I learned to express my concerns directly instead of hoping he would intuitively understand what I needed. We both learned that healing from trauma requires patience, persistence, and professional support. The public attention eventually died down, but the impact of our story continued to resonate in our community. Several women told me that our case had inspired them to report their own experiences with sexual assault. The nonprofit where I worked began implementing new safety protocols for events to prevent similar incidents. Kellerman's conviction sent a message that prominent community members were not above the law when it came to sexual violence. Looking back on this period of our lives, I can see how easily everything could have gone differently. If I had continued to doubt my instincts and accept Marcus's explanations for his behavior, Kellerman might never have been caught. If Marcus had been more successful in convincing me that my concerns were irrational, other women might have continued to be victimized. The very emotional responses that everyone told me were excessive had ultimately led to justice and protection for multiple victims. This experience taught me that being called too emotional is often a red flag that someone is trying to invalidate legitimate concerns. Women's intuition and emotional intelligence are valuable tools for detecting danger and deception, but they are frequently dismissed as hysterical or irrational. Learning to trust my own perceptions, even when others questioned them, was essential for uncovering the truth about what had happened to our family. The DNA test that had started this entire journey had provided answers, but not the ones I had expected. Instead of revealing an affair, it had exposed an assault. Instead of destroying our marriage, it had ultimately strengthened it by forcing us to confront our problems honestly. Instead of being a source of shame, it had become a tool for justice that protected other women from harm. Sophia was growing up in a family that valued truth, even when that truth was complicated and painful. She was learning that adults could make mistakes and hurt each other, but that they could also apologize, change their behavior, and work to repair the damage they had caused. Most importantly, she was learning that her worth was not determined by the circumstances of her conception, but by the love and care she received every day. The man who had assaulted me would spend the next 15 years in prison, unable to harm any other women. The legal system had finally held him accountable for his actions, even though it had taken years for his victims to find their voices and be believed. Justice had been delayed, but it had not been denied. As for Marcus and me, we were still married, but our relationship looked very different than it had before. We communicated more directly, trusted each other more completely, and prioritized honesty over harmony. We had learned that a marriage built on assumptions and silence was ultimately fragile, while a marriage built on truth and vulnerability could withstand even the most devastating revelations. The journey from suspicion to revelation to justice had been long and painful, but it had also been necessary. Sometimes the most important truths are the ones that hurt the most to uncover. Sometimes being too emotional is actually being exactly emotional enough to recognize when something is wrong and to keep fighting until the truth comes to light. 2 years after Kellerman's conviction, I stood in the courthouse lobby watching the final chapter of our legal journey unfold. The civil lawsuit we had filed against him was settled that morning, providing financial compensation that we planned to put into a trust fund for Sophia's future education and therapy needs. More importantly, the settlement included provisions for funding sexual assault prevention programs at venues throughout the city. The monetary aspect felt secondary to the symbolic victory. Kellerman's conviction had sent a clear message that drugging and assaulting women would not be tolerated, regardless of someone's social status or financial resources. The civil settlement reinforced that message while providing resources to prevent similar crimes from happening to other victims. Marcus stood beside me as we watched our attorney finalize the paperwork, his presence steady and supportive, in a way that would have seemed impossible during the darkest period of our marriage. The man who had once dismissed my concerns as emotional overreaction had become my strongest advocate for pursuing justice. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but it had been genuine and lasting. Our marriage counselor, Dr. Andrea Hoffman, had warned us that recovering from the type of betrayal and trauma we had experienced would require years of consistent work. She had been right about the timeline, but she had also been right about the possibility of emerging stronger than before. The couple sitting in that courthouse lobby bore little resemblance to the people who had lived in suspicion and silence just a few years earlier. The healing process had been neither linear nor predictable. There were weeks when Marcus and I felt like we were making significant progress, communicating openly and rebuilding intimacy with careful attention to each other's needs. Then something would trigger memories of the months when he had gaslit me, or I would have nightmares about the assault, and we would feel like we were back at square one. Dr. Hoffman had taught us to view these setbacks as normal parts of trauma recovery, rather than signs that our relationship was doomed. She helped us develop tools for managing flashbacks, communication breakdowns, and the complicated emotions that arose as we processed what had happened to our family. Most importantly, she had helped us understand that healing required patience with ourselves and each other. One of the most significant changes in our relationship was how we handled disagreements and concerns. Where Marcus had once dismissed my emotional responses as irrational, he now listened carefully and asked questions to understand what I was experiencing. Where I had once tried to suppress my instincts to avoid being labeled as too emotional, I now expressed my feelings directly and expected them to be taken seriously. This shift had implications beyond our marriage. At work, I became more assertive about advocating for my ideas and pushing back against colleagues who tried to dismiss my contributions. In social situations, I trusted my instincts about people and situations, instead of overriding my gut feelings to be polite or accommodating. The experience of having my perceptions validated so dramatically had given me confidence to trust myself in all areas of life. Sophia, now 5 years old, remained wonderfully oblivious to the complexities of her origin story. She knew that her daddy worked in construction, that her mommy helped children through her job, and that they both loved her unconditionally. She knew that there had been some grown-up problems that required lots of meetings with other adults, but that everything was better now. We had decided to wait until she was at least 10 years old before beginning to explain the truth about her conception. Child psychologists had advised us that she needed to develop a strong sense of security and self-worth before being burdened with knowledge about the assault. When the time came, we would tell her the story gradually, emphasizing that she was wanted and loved regardless of the circumstances that led to her existence. In the meantime, Marcus had legally adopted Sophia to ensure that his parental rights were protected, regardless of biological relationships. The adoption process had been emotional for all of us, symbolizing his commitment to being her father in every way that mattered. Sophia had been excited about the special ceremony at the courthouse, though she hadn't fully understood its significance. The adoption had also provided an opportunity to create new family traditions that emphasized choice and commitment over biological connections. We started an annual Adoption Day celebration that focused on how families can be formed through love and dedication, rather than just genetics. Sophia loved having an extra special day each year, and the tradition helped reinforce the message that the strongest families are built on intentional bonds. Our extended family relationships had evolved significantly throughout this process. Marcus's parents and sister had been shocked to learn about the assault, and devastated to realize how their son's assumptions had harmed our marriage. Carmen had cried when she learned that I had been drugged and assaulted, apologizing for not recognizing the signs that something was seriously wrong during the months when Marcus was emotionally withdrawing. Roberto had been particularly troubled by the revelation that his business success and community standing had blinded him to the possibility that other successful men might be predators. He began supporting organizations that work to prevent sexual violence, using his influence in the construction industry to promote workplace safety and accountability. His response had shown me that people could learn and grow from even the most painful revelations. Isabella had become one of my closest allies throughout the healing process. She had been appalled by her brother's behavior during the period when he was punishing me for something that wasn't my fault. Her anger at Marcus had actually helped him understand the severity of what he had done, since criticism from his beloved sister carried more weight than anything our marriage counselor, or I could say. The Martinez family's support had been crucial for our recovery, but it had also highlighted how different my own family's response had been. When I told my parents about the assault and the legal proceedings, their reactions had been disappointingly familiar. My mother had immediately focused on how the publicity might affect my career, while my father had questioned whether pursuing legal action was worth the stress and exposure. Neither of them had expressed outrage at what had been done to me, or pride in my courage for seeking justice. Neither had offered emotional support or asked how they could help our family through the crisis. Their responses had reinforced my understanding that some people simply lack the capacity for empathy and support, even when their own family members are the victims. I had long since stopped expecting emotional availability from my parents, but their reaction to the assault had been so tone-deaf that it crystallized my decision to maintain only superficial contact with them going forward. Sophia deserved to be surrounded by adults who prioritized her well-being and emotional security, which meant limiting her exposure to people who consistently failed to provide appropriate support. The contrast between the Martinez family's response and my parents' reaction had been instructive for Marcus as well. He had come to understand that my expectations for emotional support weren't excessive or unrealistic, but rather reflected normal human needs that his family had always met naturally. This realization had helped him recognize how his dismissive behavior during our crisis had been even more harmful than he had initially understood. As we rebuilt our marriage, we also rebuilt our social circle to include people who valued emotional intelligence and honest communication. We gravitated toward friends who took sexual assault seriously, who understood trauma recovery, and who supported survivors rather than questioning their experiences. This process had been isolating at times, as we discovered that some people we had considered close friends were uncomfortable with the reality of sexual violence. But we had also connected with other survivors and their families, creating a network of people who understood the long-term impact of assault and the complexities of healing. These relationships had been invaluable for both Marcus and me, providing examples of how couples could emerge stronger after trauma, and how families could create meaning from even the most devastating experiences. One of the most unexpected aspects of our journey had been the way it transformed my professional life. My experience with being gaslit and having my perceptions dismissed had given me new insight into the challenges faced by the children and families served by my nonprofit. I began developing programs specifically designed to help young people trust their instincts and advocate for themselves when adults question their concerns. The work felt like a natural extension of my own healing process. Every time I helped a teenager recognize that their feelings were valid, every time I supported a family in trusting their child's reports of inappropriate behavior, I was honoring my own experience and preventing other victims from suffering in silence. My supervisor had noticed the passion and effectiveness I brought to this work, eventually promoting me to director of a new division focused on prevention and early intervention. The position allowed me to influence policy and programming at a broader level, ensuring that trauma-informed approaches were integrated throughout our organization's services. Marcus had also found ways to channel his experience into positive action. He had joined the board of a nonprofit that provided legal advocacy for sexual assault survivors, using his business skills to help the organization expand its services and reach more victims. He often spoke to other men about recognizing and confronting sexual violence, emphasizing how bystander intervention could prevent assaults and support survivors. His involvement in advocacy work had been part of his own healing process. By working to prevent other families from experiencing what we had been through, he was making amends for the ways his initial response had compounded my trauma. The work also helped him process his guilt about doubting my character and punishing me for being victimized. Our individual healing journeys had been supported by different therapeutic approaches. I had worked with a trauma specialist who used EMDR therapy to help me process the assault and its aftermath. The technique had been remarkably effective for reducing the intensity of my flashbacks and nightmares, allowing me to function more effectively in my daily life. Marcus had worked with a therapist who specialized in helping partners of sexual assault survivors. He had needed to understand not just how to support me, but how to manage his own complex emotions about what had happened. learning that it was normal for him to feel angry at Kellerman, while also feeling guilty about his own response, had been crucial for his recovery. We had also participated in group therapy with other couples who had experienced sexual assault. Hearing other people's stories had helped us understand that our struggles were not unique or insurmountable. Seeing couples who were further along in their healing journey had given us hope for our own future. The group sessions had also provided a safe space to discuss the complicated feelings we both had about Sophia's conception. Other parents in similar situations had shared strategies for maintaining their children's sense of security while processing their own trauma. These conversations had been invaluable for developing our approach to parenting through recovery. One of the most powerful moments in our healing process had occurred during a family therapy session about 18 months after Kellerman's conviction. Sophia had been included in the session to help her understand why her parents had been going to so many meetings with Dr. Hoffman. The therapist had explained, in age-appropriate terms, that families sometimes need help working through difficult problems. Sophia had listened carefully before asking whether our family was okay now. When Dr. Hoffman asked what being okay meant to her, Sophia had said it meant that Mommy and Daddy loved each other and loved her, and that everyone felt safe and happy at home. Her simple definition had captured everything we had been working to rebuild. Dr. Hoffman had then asked each of us to share one thing we appreciated about our family. Sophia had said she loved how Daddy always read bedtime stories in funny voices, and how Mommy made the best pancakes on Saturday mornings. I had shared that I felt grateful for how honest we had all learned to be with each other. Marcus had said he appreciated getting a second chance to be the husband and father his family deserved. The session had ended with the three of us drawing a picture together of our family's future. Sophia had drawn us at a beach, explaining that she wanted to go on a vacation where we could build sandcastles and swim in the ocean. Marcus and I had looked at each other and smiled, realizing that we were finally ready to start making new happy memories together. We took that beach vacation 6 months later, spending a week in San Diego, exploring tide pools, riding roller coasters, and watching Sophia discover the joy of ocean waves. The trip had been symbolic of our family's renewal, but it had also been simply fun, in a way that we hadn't experienced together in years. Sophia's laughter, as she chased seagulls on the beach, had been the sound of healing. During quiet moments on that vacation, Marcus and I had talked about our hopes for the future. We discussed the possibility of having another child, though we agreed to wait until we felt more settled in our recovery. We talked about career goals and dreams for our family's growth. Most importantly, we talked about how we would continue prioritizing honesty and emotional connection in our relationship. The conversations had felt natural and optimistic in a way that would have been impossible during the crisis period. We were no longer walking on eggshells around each other, or afraid that any conflict might reveal deeper problems. We had learned to navigate disagreements with respect and curiosity, rather than defensiveness and manipulation. Back in the present moment, standing in that courthouse lobby after the settlement was finalized, I reflected on how far we had traveled from the place where our story had begun. The woman who had been told she was too emotional for questioning her husband's behavior had become an advocate for trusting women's instincts and taking their concerns seriously. The man who had dismissed his wife's perceptions as hormonal overreaction had become a champion for believing survivors and supporting their healing. The child who had been conceived through violence had become the center of a family built on intentional love and commitment to truth. Our attorney shook hands with each of us, congratulating us on the successful resolution of the civil case. As we walked out of the courthouse together, Marcus took my hand in the same natural way he had done thousands of times before, but the gesture felt different now. It was a choice we both made every day to remain connected, rather than an automatic habit from easier times. Sophia was spending the afternoon with Carmen and Roberto, who had offered to pick her up from kindergarten and take her to the park. They understood that the legal proceedings were emotionally draining for Marcus and me, and they had become reliable sources of support for our family throughout the recovery process. Their transformation from people who had dismissed my concerns to advocates for our healing had been remarkable to witness. We drove home in comfortable silence, both of us processing the emotions that came with this final legal milestone. The settlement wouldn't bring back the innocence we had lost, or erase the trauma we had experienced, but it represented acknowledgement and accountability that many survivors never receive. At home, we sat together on the couch, where we had had so many difficult conversations during our healing process. The living room looked the same as it had years earlier, but the atmosphere was completely different. Where there had once been tension and mistrust, there was now peace and connection. I keep thinking about what Dr. Hoffman said about post-traumatic growth, Marcus said, breaking the comfortable silence. How sometimes people can become stronger and more resilient after experiencing trauma, rather than just returning to their previous state. I nodded, understanding what he meant. We weren't the same people we had been before the assault and its aftermath, nor would we want to be. The experience had been devastating, but it had also taught us valuable lessons about trust, communication, and the importance of believing survivors. I'm grateful for the people we've become, I replied. Even though I wouldn't wish what we went through on anyone, I'm proud of how we handled it once we finally understood what had really happened. Marcus squeezed my hand, his expression serious. I'm still working on forgiving myself for how I treated you during those months when I thought you had been unfaithful. Every time someone tells me I'm a good husband or father, I remember how badly I failed you when you needed me most. This was a conversation we had had many times before, and one that would probably continue throughout our lives. Marcus's guilt about his initial response was the hardest part of his healing journey, and it couldn't be resolved through any single conversation or insight. You're not the same person who made those assumptions, I reminded him. The Marcus I'm married to now would never respond to a crisis by withdrawing and punishing instead of communicating and supporting. People can learn and change, and you've proven that every day for the past 2 years. It was true. The man sitting beside me bore little resemblance to the person who had gaslit me into questioning my own sanity. Marcus had done the difficult work of examining his biases, understanding the impact of his behavior, and developing new patterns of response. He had shown me through consistent actions that he was worthy of my trust again. Our conversation was interrupted by the sound of a car in the driveway, followed by Sophia's excited voice calling out as she ran toward the front door. She burst into the living room with her usual energy, immediately launching into a detailed account of her adventures at the park with her grandparents. As I listened to her chatter about the ducks she had fed and the playground equipment she had conquered, I was struck by her complete sense of security and belonging. Despite the chaos and trauma that had surrounded the first few years of her life, she had emerged as a confident, joyful child who trusted the adults in her life to protect and support her. This was perhaps our greatest achievement through the entire ordeal. We had managed to shield Sophia from the worst of the crisis, while rebuilding our family on a foundation of honesty and love. She had never doubted that she was wanted and cherished, even during the periods when Marcus and I were struggling to trust each other. That evening, as we went through our usual bedtime routine with Sophia, I felt a deep sense of gratitude for the ordinary moments that had once felt threatened. Reading stories, singing lullabies, and tucking her into bed with kisses and promises to see her in the morning were privileges that we had nearly lost during the darkest period of our marriage. After Sophia was asleep, Marcus and I returned to the living room to continue processing the day's events. The settlement had provided closure to the legal aspects of our case, but it had also prompted reflection on how much our lives had changed since that first DNA test had upended everything we thought we knew about our family. Do you ever regret ordering the test? Marcus asked, a question that had come up periodically during our recovery. I considered the question carefully before answering. I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret getting the truth. If I hadn't tested Sophia's paternity, Kellerman would still be out there assaulting other women. You and I would still be living with the poison of your incorrect assumptions about my faithfulness. Our marriage might not have survived much longer. This was a truth we had come to accept over time. The DNA test had been devastating in the short term, but it had ultimately saved our marriage by forcing us to confront the lies and assumptions that were destroying our relationship. Without that catalyst, we might have continued deteriorating until divorce became inevitable. I'm grateful that you trusted your instincts enough to investigate, Marcus said, even when I was telling you that your concerns were unfounded, even when everyone around you was suggesting that you were being paranoid or emotional. You knew something was wrong, and you didn't give up until you found the truth. The validation still felt meaningful, even years after the fact. For too long, I had been told that my emotional responses were excessive or inappropriate. Learning to trust my instincts again had been a crucial part of my healing, and having that trust acknowledged by the person who had most undermined it felt significant. We talked late into the evening about our hopes for the future. Marcus shared his dreams of eventually expanding his role in the family business to include more community development projects that would benefit underserved neighborhoods. I told him about my ideas for creating a national model for trauma-informed youth services that could be replicated in other cities. Both of our professional goals had been shaped by our experience with seeking justice and healing from trauma. We wanted to use our privilege and resources to create positive change that might prevent other families from experiencing what we had been through. As we prepared for bed that night, I felt a sense of completion that had been missing for years. The legal proceedings were finished. Our marriage was stronger than it had ever been. Sophia was thriving in an environment of security and love. We had transformed our trauma into purpose, and our pain into power. Looking back on the journey from suspicion to DNA test to investigation to conviction to healing, I could see how each step had been necessary for reaching this point. The woman who had been called too emotional for questioning her husband's behavior had learned to value her emotional intelligence as a tool for recognizing truth and seeking justice. The experience had taught me that being called too emotional is often a sign that someone is trying to invalidate legitimate concerns. Women's intuition and emotional responses are frequently dismissed as irrational or excessive, particularly when they threaten existing power structures or comfortable assumptions. I had learned to distinguish between being overwhelmed by emotions and being guided by emotional wisdom. The former could cloud judgment and lead to poor decisions, but the latter was a valuable source of information about people and situations that shouldn't be ignored. Our story had become part of a larger conversation about believing survivors and taking their concerns seriously from the beginning. Every time I spoke at conferences or trained service providers about trauma-informed approaches, I emphasized the importance of trusting people's instincts and emotional responses rather than dismissing them as excessive. The phrase "too emotional" had become a red flag for me in both professional and personal contexts. When someone used emotional responses to dismiss legitimate concerns, I now recognized it as a manipulation tactic rather than a valid criticism. This awareness had made me a more effective advocate for the families I served and a stronger partner in my marriage. As I fell asleep that night beside Marcus, with Sophia safe in her bed down the hall, I felt grateful for the strength that had carried us through the darkest period of our lives. The road had been longer and more difficult than I could have imagined, but it had led us to a place of greater authenticity, deeper connection, and more purposeful living. The DNA test that had shattered our illusions had ultimately revealed the truth that set us free. Being too emotional had turned out to be exactly emotional enough to recognize danger, seek justice, and protect our family. The very qualities that others had criticized as weaknesses had become our greatest strengths. Our story was one of many that demonstrated the power of trusting women's instincts and taking their concerns seriously from the beginning. It was a reminder that emotional responses often contain valuable information that shouldn't be dismissed as irrational or excessive. Most importantly, it was proof that even the most devastating revelations could lead to healing, growth, and stronger relationships when approached with courage, honesty, and commitment to truth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.